Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalam ala Rasulil Kareem wa ala alihi wa ashabihi wa man istanna bi sunnatihim ila yawmiddin. All praise is due to Allah, and may Allah's peace and blessings be on the last Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam, and on all those who follow the path of righteousness until the last day. This session, as we said, was to be a review of the material that we've covered from the introduction down to the reasons for conflicting rulings among the various schools of thought and the scholars. So what we're going to do is just try to run through the questions. We have about 60 or 70 minutes. We'll try to run through the questions, focusing on those which require some explanation, those which are obvious and just requiring texts which are already in the book. Then inshallah we can skip those in order to cover the full range of questions. We have about 60 questions, so it means we have basically about a little over a minute per question. Okay, so to begin, from the introduction, the dilemma faced by new Muslims and others regarding the madhabs and their contradictions, and the two incorrect positions that the people commonly take. Okay, what's the dilemma?
That one has to be followed.
No, dilemma is not that one has to be followed.
The dilemma is where the people they give precedence to the madhabs over what them.
No, it's not a question of precedence.
Rigidity.
No. What is the dilemma faced by new Muslims and others who contemplate the rulings of the madhab? And it says here, and their contradiction.
Which one is
The dilemma. No, dilemma is how can two things be correct and at the same time they're opposites? How can something be right and wrong at the same time? You know? So this is the dilemma. The madhab says all madhabs are correct. You just have to follow one of them. So if they're all correct, and one says if you touch a woman you have wudu, another one says if you touch a woman you don't have wudu, then how can it be possible that you could possibly have wudu and not have wudu at the same time? It's a dilemma, right? That is the problem. And there are many examples of that, right? So the two incorrect positions that people commonly take, people go to two extremes. What are they? How do they respond to the dilemma? One says rigidity means how does it? Yeah, it just we don't. This is something we can't understand. You know, it is like the Trinity. How it can be three in one. We don't need to have to understand it. It's just you follow it, blindly follow it. You just have to stick to one, and that's it. That's one extreme. The other extreme is
they don't follow anything.
Nothing.
They go back.
No madhabs. Finish. We'll just follow Qur'an and Sunnah. Okay, that sounds good. Why is that not acceptable? Why is that considered an extreme? For somebody to say, I'm just going to follow Qur'an and Sunnah.
You have to follow it according to the understanding of the Salaf.
Okay, they say, I'm going to follow it according to the understanding of the Salaf. Qur'an and Sunnah.
Because there were many positions. The Prophet ﷺ was...
No. The basic point is, we don't have the ability to go to the Qur'an and the Sunnah and extract the laws ourselves. That's the bottom line. The average person, of course there are scholars, they have the ability, but the average person doesn't have the ability. So to say, yes, theoretically I follow Qur'an and Sunnah according to the understanding of the Salaf, but how do I do it? I do it through scholars. So once you're doing it through scholars, you're going to end up following a madhab, one way or another. Right? Number two, Three differences between fiqh and sharia. Okay, those are listed, right? Explain why the claim that Islamic law is outdated and primitive is false. That was an assignment question given to you. That was one of your assignment questions, right? So you have to turn that in. We can skip it. Go on. Okay, give me one difference between fiqh and sharia.
Fiqh is the deduction of the laws, and sharia is the actual law that was given to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
Fiqh is the deduction of the law, and sharia is the actual law given to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Oh, something like that.
Sharia is general or specific.
Fiqh is the science.
Fiqh, sharia the laws of sharia tend to be general, and those of fiqh tend to be very detailed and specific. Yes, that's one difference.
I'm a bit confused, but I think one stays and the other one changes according to the situation.
Yeah, okay, one stays, one changes, but you need to be specific.
Sharia,
which one does?
Sharia remains the same.
Fiqh varies, yes. So the other basic point to note is that sharia is revelation. Fiqh is reasoning. Applying that revelation through human reasoning. That's the basic difference. Okay, explain the claim that the Islamic law is outdated. Okay, so why is then Islamic law not outdated?
If you're able to apply it in all the ages, all the times, and we have seen results of.
Why? I mean, issue of application, one could apply a primitive law today. There are people doing it. You have people applying primitive laws today. So the issue is that's not the issue. Somebody else.
Because it is the law from the Creator who knows His creation better than any human being.
Sure. Allah is the one who created human beings and knows the laws which are based on their natures, which don't change. The natures which change, then the laws will change. The primary laws, which are based on revelation, don't change because human societies, human beings don't change. So that's why the law never becomes outdated, because it addresses the Sharia, the revelation, addresses fundamental issues about human beings and their society which are unchangeable. Whereas the aspects of the society which do change, that does require technology, development, which requires now changes in laws to keep up with the development, those come out of fiqh. And the fiqh is flexible. Fiqh has that ability to change with time. Okay? So that's why it doesn't become outdated, it is applicable, and why it would be acceptable at all times. Chapter 1, Foundation. Foundation looks at the period of what? Period of the Prophet ﷺ. Okay, and the Meccan and Medinan revelations, which form the foundation of the legal structure, compare and contrast them with regards to the laws. Meccan and Medina revelation.
Meccan revelation was mainly on Aqidah, to fix the Aqidah in the hearts of the people to make them stronger. And Medina was mainly the laws, the actual Sharia.
Yeah. Okay, most of your laws, societal laws, etc., are revealed in the Medinan period. These are the Medinan verses. Meccan verses tended to be focusing on Tawheed, spiritual matters, Akhirah, these kinds of things. Yeah. Okay, that's one. We asked three different things here, but it's sufficient to look. Okay, look at people of the book and the hypocrites. Meccan revelations concerning people of the book. Very few, because they weren't really dealing with them. What about the hypocrites?
Yes, there was
Hypocrites in Mecca?
In Medina.
No. In Mecca, there weren't any. Not known. The hypocrites in Medina, why? Because Medina, Islam was strong. In Mecca, Islam is weak. You find a hypocrite, one who pretends to be a Muslim, he's going to do that because there's some benefit in it.
Yes.
In Mecca, there's no benefit. You become a Muslim and you're just suffering, right? In Medina, Muslims became strong. They became the power. Prophet Muhammad ﷺ became the ruler of Medina. So to join that, you're joining the winning side. So there was, value in into being a hypocrite. Identify two basic categories in which the legal content of the Quran is divided, with examples of both. Legal content of the Quran is divided into laws concerning Allah and laws concerning human beings, human society. Right? Those are the main two categories. Number 7, discuss the position of Islam between reformation and cancellation with regards to pre-Islamic customs and practices. How did Islam treat society and its practices? It reformed it. It didn't just wipe out everything and bring something totally new. That's the principle here, right? It reformed. It didn't just come to cancel.
It actually corrected which was wrong. It kept which was okay and basically modified which was wrong. That's how it came. It didn't cancel all the law.
No, it cancelled what was false and wrong. It modified what was good but deviated, and it affirmed what was good and pure. Examples of how Islamic law came to remove difficulties from human life. Give me one example.
Making it easier, making ease on the
How? Give me one example.
salah when somebody is traveling, fasting.
One of the things was during the earlier days where they used to not give equal rights to the woman. Islam came and gave the rights to the woman, and also when they were not treated properly, Islam came and gave the laws of how they have been treated.
Well, in terms of removing difficulty, okay, to some degree, but if we look at the example given in the book, we have examples like that of the iddah, of the woman whose husband dies. Before it was a year.
Yes.
Then it became reduced to 3 months and 10 days. Right? So that is a clear reduction of a difficulty from human life.
From the earlier period of Islam.
Yeah, it was already a year in normal practice. Islam first went along with what was there, then it reduced it. Religious obligations reduced. Question number 9, the example you just gave before of fasting, person not having to fast when they're traveling, and these are many examples of those, right? 2 examples of how Islam realized public welfare in its legislation. Public welfare in legislation.
Was this the zakat where the money was taken from the rich and given welfare?
On the issue of inheritance.
Inheritance.
Before, I think the law was that
The fathers were not given anything.
the law was that I think people from outside were people who came to Islam inherited from others, and then Allah changed. Allah wrote the revelation that the family had more.
Somebody have a book here? Realization of public welfare. Yeah, the inheritance.
The father was not involved in the inheritance earlier, but Islam gave the rights to the fathers.
And also didn't allow, for example, those people, this is from the Sunnah, didn't allow those people who were already inheriting, they were not allowed to, no bequest was allowed to be given for them. Right? It's an example of it. Okay, discuss the example, with an example, the explanation of the rationale behind legal pronouncements. What does it indicate? When the Prophet ﷺ made legal pronouncements and explained the rationale behind the laws, then it allowed people to deduce, right? To deduce other laws based on the understanding of the principle behind it. This is part of the public welfare in its legislation. That's just an aspect of it. Universal justice. How is universal justice realized?
One of the hadiths of Prophet where he said that even like somebody takes somebody else's property, even if my daughter takes it, then her hand will be cut off.
Yeah, the Prophet ﷺ in his own practice regarding his family and others, he stated that he would treat them the same. That there was no distinction between people, applying the law to everybody across the board and equally. So he said, even if my own daughter had stolen, her hand would have been cut off. Going on to the sources of Islamic law during the Prophet's time were Revelation, Qur'an and Sunnah. What about the ijtihad of the Prophet ﷺ? Was that a source of?
No.
Huh? No?
Whatever he said was from
What about the ijtihad of the Sahaba? No, during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, there was some ijtihad of the Sahaba. We gave examples of it. How is that considered? What was the purpose of it? If it wasn't a source of Islamic law, or do we believe it was a source of Islamic law? Ijtihad of the Prophet? No? Okay. So it was training. Training for the Prophet ﷺ, it was also to show, because where Allah corrected the Prophet ﷺ, it affirmed that he was a human being, capable of error. To remove from the minds of the people that he was infallible in all aspects, right? But, so it was training. His ijtihad was to train them in making ijtihad. And him allowing them to make ijtihad in circumstances was to give them actual practice in it. Okay, to the era of establishment. Okay, what era is that?
The era of the righteous caliphs.
Righteous caliphs. Yeah. Okay, righteous caliphs, major Sahaba. Problem solving procedures. That's just the steps, right? That they would look first in the Qur'an, then they would look in the Sunnah, and and so and so, right? Discuss the approaches of the Sahaba to their personal rulings. How did the Sahaba look at their personal rulings? They looked at it as being from themselves, and they would say that, this is my ijtihad. If it's correct, then it's blessing from Allah, and if it's mistake, it's from myself and from Satan. So they wouldn't give special preference to their own ijtihad, and as a fact, they would try to avoid making rulings. Oftentimes people would come and ask them questions, and they would send them to others. Go to Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, go to Abdullah ibn Umar, etc. So two trends in fiqh which developed in this period was between the fiqh of Medina and the fiqh of Iraq. Kufa. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud in Kufa.
On reasoning, moral reasoning.
Yes.
And what was basically the sins.
Yeah, the difference between those who focused on the narrations and the obvious meanings of the narrations, and those who sought to deduce laws and principles behind the narrations. So we had fiqh, Ahlul Ra'i, and Ahl. Ra'i is the opinion, reasoning people. And the other one, you could call them really Ahlul Hadith, that general trend was starting from there. This developed in the later periods. Okay, what is the main features of the madhab during the era of establishment?
It was the madhab of the Khalifa at that time.
Yeah, it was the madhab of the Khalifa. And what were the elements? At this time it became Qur'an, Sunnah and Ijma'. Ijma was added here, right? Because they would, that was the approach of the caliphs, that they would gather the people together and make an ijma, right? And then if they couldn't establish an ijma, then the Khalifa would make his own qiyas, right? So the qiyas was being used because that was the foundation of ijma. The building period of building, this is the period of the Umayyads, right? So there were 4 factors affecting the fiqh at that time. One was the division of the ummah into sects, right? Secondly, the deviation of the Umayyad caliphs, which meant that the scholars no longer sought to be around the caliphs. You know, they were not encouraged. They in fact, they tried to avoid them. Thirdly, that was the dispersion of the scholars. That was the third consequence. And fourth, the fabrication of hadith. Fabrication of hadith.
What was the third one?
Third one is the scattering of the scholars.
So because of the competition they used to have in the court.
No. That was due to the deviation of the caliphs. With the caliphs deviating, not introducing deviations into their court, then the scholars didn't want to stay at their centers anymore. They preferred to be elsewhere.
But music also was part of this thing, and that's why they left also. That was one of the reasons. They introduced music and all.
Yeah, this is part of the deviations. Yeah.
What is the fourth one?
Fourth one is fabrication of hadith. This is the consequence. Now we could say really 1 and 4 are related, and 2 and 3 are related. Because 1, the division of the ummah into sects, that then produced fabrication of hadiths.
Even 3 and 4 is related, right? Because since the scholar dispersed, people started putting their own.
I don't think so. Not so much so. It's more deviation of the ummah 2 and 3. Deviation of the caliphs led to dispersion of the ummah, of the scholars, the ulama. And division of the ummah led to fabrication of hadiths, where these different sects which were being formed would fabricate hadiths to give themselves legitimacy. Right? So those were the interrelated factors. In terms of characteristics of fiqh, we said explain what led to the vast increase in the number of ijtihads in this era.
This was actually in the Iraq where they used to not trust because of the fabrication of the hadith, so they used to always.
No, that's not the correct answer. It had nothing to do with fabrication of hadiths. The vast increase in the number of ijtihads was because of the fact that the scholars scattered. When the scholars were together, then leading scholars would make the ijtihad and the others would be around them supporting them, ijma'. But once they scattered, then the scholars were all on their own, in their dispersed areas, and they had to make ijtihad themselves. So naturally, the amount of ijtihad is going to increase. Characteristics of fiqh in that time. We had the Ahli Hadith, Ahli Ra'i, becoming more prominent and obvious. Compilation of fiqh taking place. Right? Okay, the fourth stage, the flowering. That was the era of the Abbasids, first 200 years of the Abbasid eras. Right? First 100 years represents that the period of the major imams, and second 100 the minor imams. So what are the factors which led to flowering of fiqh during the era of the great imams of the Abbasid period, first 100 years? Main factor was Umayyad caliphs encouraged fiqh. They themselves became fuqaha. They encouraged fiqh around them, scholars around them, because their main call to legitimacy was that they were bringing the sharia back. bringing the caliphate back to the way of the Prophet ﷺ. And that's why they gathered the Alids around them, the people from the Alawi family. They tried to bring them, and even one of them, was made a crown. We could say what do they call him now? You could not crown prince because it's a king, but the caliph in waiting, you could say. One of them was designated to be the next caliph, a khalifa. So, discuss the stages in the compilation of fiqh. Okay, that's just straight out of the book. Fiqh in the early period tended to be a mixture, and as time passed, it became more and more specific, right? Muwatta Malik is the mixture, right? The books of Shafi'i, much more specific, Usul al-Fiqh, etc. The impact of compilation of hadiths on the development of fiqh. What was the impact? Why would the compilation of hadiths have an impact on the fiqh? How? Why? Huh? Well, compilation made the hadith more available, yes. It meant that the scholars didn't have to spend time searching for the hadiths, so they could focus more on explaining these hadiths and how to apply them, right? Once they had, because made the hadiths available, so it meant that they could spend more time in understanding, deriving principles, as opposed to spending much of their time just hunting down the hadiths in the first place. Identify 6 sources of fiqh during this era. Of course, these are the well-known 4 that we mentioned before. What were the 2 additional sources that were added to fiqh in this period?
What is the customs code?
Urf,
And one is legal, something.
istihsan. Yeah. Istihsan, legal preference, and urf, customs. Right? Those are the additional 2 to what we had before. Okay. We spoke about the compilation of hadith, but there was also another factor which was going on then, that was the court debates. What were the impact of the court debates on the madhabs?
They used, because basically one was to, it was like, what do you call status part also were basically.
What was the impact of, try to answer, get straight to the question. What was the impact of court debates on the madhabs? Impact was that it focused, or it promoted factionalism and rigidity. My madhab, do or die. Because you're debating, you don't want to lose the argument, so you'll use anything, any means to save your face, win the prize, defend the madhab. So madhab, do or die, that became the call. So court debates helped to, you could say, fossilize the madhabs and make them much more rigid. Okay, the madhabs themselves, we have Abu Hanifa. How do we refute the claim that Abu Hanifa was weak in hadith? This is why, his madhab depended so much on the reasoning.
Abu Hanifa was in Iraq, and that was the place for fabrication of hadith. That's why they didn't rely much on the.
No, but that is not refuting the claim that Abu Hanifa was weak in hadith. Because I could say that's affirming it. Because there were so many fabricated hadiths, there's only few sahih ones. So he was weak in hadith means he only had a few hadiths. How do we refute this? It's refuted by the fact that his teacher, Hamad ibn Zayd, right? His teacher was one of the leading scholars of hadith of that era. Right? That was one of his teachers. So that shoots that whole argument down altogether. His teaching method was to present issues, then look for the proofs. The opposite of Imam Malik was to present the proofs, then look for the issues. Okay? That's the contrast between the two methods. And we come to a question is going to come up like that. Right? The limitation placed, which the explanation you were just giving was the answer to question number 29. The limitations placed on the use of the Sunnah because of the widespread fabrication in Iraq where Abu Hanif was based, then they put the limitation of the hadith having to be mashhur or well known. Okay, question 30. Position of Abu Hanifa regarding the opinions of the Sahaba when they agreed and when they disagreed. His basic position was giving preference to the opinions of the Sahaba. Over his own opinion. Yeah, over his own opinion. Which would be based on qiyas. Mention who was Abu Yusuf?
His student.
One of his prominent students. And how did he promote the Hanafi madhab?
He was one of the judges, I think.
He was made a chief judge.
Chief judge.
And he appointed judges throughout the realm who are from his madhab school. Muhammad ibn al-Hasan's relationship with Imam Malik.
He studied under Imam Malik as well, and he wrote that he learned the Muwatta by heart.
Yeah, he's a narrator of Imam Malik's book Al-Muwatta. Studied under Imam Malik for a number of years. Yet he was one of the leading students of Abu Hanifa. Okay, why may it be said that the Hanafi madhab was more a product of Abu Hanifa's students and later scholars than himself?
It changed more than half of the rulings.
Yeah, his own students changed more than half of his rulings, and of course later scholars added and added. And really that can be said about all of the schools. It's really not limited to his school, but to his school it became more obvious, you know. But the other schools, the same thing happened, but not in as an obvious a way. Why? Because the leading students of Abu Hanifa stayed with him. They stayed with him, meaning they stayed and considered that they were promoting his school, his approach. Whereas the leading school students of Imam Malik, for example, the top student, who was he? Imam Shafi'i. He left. He was a student, but he ended up forming his own madhab. Same thing with the leading student of Imam Shafi'i. Who was he? Ahmed ibn Hanbal. He was his leading student, really. And he formed his own, right? Whereas in the case of Abu Hanifa, his two top students, they stuck with him. Nobody went from him and formed another madhab. So whatever changes took place within the madhab, and that's why it was so obvious. Whereas in the case of Imam Malik, you know, for example, the leading student who was going to make the change broke away altogether, gathered other information and made another madhab altogether. Whereas his other students who were lesser students, although they ended up being the leading ones that stayed with him, they continued his own line of reasoning. They made changes, but not as drastic changes as Imam Shafi'i did. Right? The main reason for the disappearance of Awza'i's madhab,
Summarizes the Muqtasar of Muzani. That's right. The Shafi'i.
Yeah, that Shafi'i scholars were given prominent positions as judges in the area where his madhab was more widespread, and they promoted the madhab by encouraging students to memorize books of Shafi'i fiqh. Imam Malik's relationship with the Sahaba. What was the relationship with the
He
Sahaba?
was the grandson of a prominent Sahaba.
Sahabi, yeah. He was the grandson of a prominent Sahabi. And why didn't he travel much?
Except for
Why didn't he travel much? Because of the wealth of knowledge. There was a storehouse of knowledge there in Medina. You know, many of the leading scholars stayed there. You know, so he didn't have to travel. As in the case of others who were from other areas, they had to do a lot of traveling. But he knew its limitations, right? So Imam Malik's book, before that, discussed the significance of Imam Malik's teacher, Nafi', and used him as an example to refute the claim that Islam did not prohibit slavery.
Nafi was a freed slave of Abdullah bin Umar,
Yeah.
and he was a very prominent scholar.
Mm-hmm.
And Imam Malik took
So how?
the golden chain that he used between him and Abdullah bin Umar.
And the Prophet
The
ﷺ.
Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
Yeah, I mean, the point is that on one hand, Nafi', who was a freed slave, was his teacher. But how do we refute the claims that Islam did not prohibit slavery with that?
Because Nafi was a slave, and then from there he prominently became one of the biggest scholars.
Is that a refutation?
It shows that the slave didn't remain a slave; he became.
Okay, we can just say that Islam didn't prohibit slavery. You see, this does not refute the prohibition of slavery, because Islam didn't prohibit slavery. But that the institution as it existed in the Muslim world was not the same as it was in the other societies, where it was possible for somebody from slave origins to rise to some of the top and prominent positions in the society. Where in the other societies where slavery was really a completely evil institution, then there was no opportunity like that for anybody. The origin of Malik's book Al-Muwatta was the request of the Caliph to prepare a constitution. Why did it change? Why did it change a lot? You have so many different narrations of the Muwatta. Because he was constantly adding to it and deleting from it. As he got new students from different areas and they taught him new things, you know, he would immediately change it. That's why his book wasn't rigid. And that's why he didn't want to make it a constitution, because he knew it was in a state of flux, it was in a state of change himself, and that he hadn't gathered all of the hadiths from all over the Muslim world. What's the rationale for Imam Malik giving precedence to the practices of the Madinites over ijma'? How did he consider the practice of the Madinites? As a living sunnah. So the sunnah is given precedence over ijma', which is a consensus of Sahaba's opinion. Whereas the customs of the Madinites, according to him, he saw it as living sunnah, as opposed to sunnah transmitted by word or by written form. What's the difference between the practice and the customs of the Madinites?
One is individual.
He started explaining already.
Sorry,
Individual and the other is ijma'.
Which one is which?
The customs, practices, the individual customs.
No, actually in the book.
So the jama'ah and the practices were the individual.
No. Actually in the book, we use practice to refer to the group. That's on page 97. Amal al-Madina is the practices of the Madinites. Whereas the custom of the Madinites, that's point 798, that refer to individual or isolated practices among them. Maybe the wording might have been better the other way around. It has that feeling, but the point is that the terminology used is Amal Ahl al-Madina, which is their practice. The practice of the people of Medina. What was the people of Medina's practice? Whereas the custom or customs of the Medinites is not necessarily something done by everybody there. Some of them might do it, others might not do it. So it was a custom there, but a custom among a small group or few individuals. Istihsan, istislah, that's a bit technical. Three main differences between the Hanafi and Maliki approaches to fiqh. That's again going back to the same different principles that each madhab recognized. Two leading students of Imam Malik who founded their own madhab. I mentioned Shafi already. Who was the other one? Huh? No, it wasn't Dawood al-Zahiri. No, the other person was that we mentioned was Abu Thawr. No, not the Thawri, but Abu al-Thawr. If I'm not mistaken, that is on page.
Will we send this out by now? We haven't received this by email.
It was sent today. Maybe that's why I haven't seen it. I haven't received it yet?
No.
Well, anyway, these questions, you have them in the hard copy.
Yeah, I prefer
So.
the soft copy because I've scribbled all over it. So
Yeah, anyway, the soft copy was sent out. Inshallah, it will be, if you didn't receive it, then we'll have the secretary send it, right? Carrying on. One oh six is here's a different. Under what heading? What's the heading you have there? No, it doesn't mention there that he was a student of Imam Malik. Oh no, that's a mistake. Abu Thawr, he was a student along with Ahmad ibn Hanbal of Imam Shafi'i. So here it's just really one student. So rather than two leading students, it should be a leading student.
About two leading students of Imam Shafi'i.
Yeah, that would be under Imam Shafi'i.
Two leading students of Imam Malik were Al-Qasim and Ibn Wahb.
But they didn't form their own madhab.
Yeah, now in here it says two leading students.
You know, but I'm saying the question was, mention two leading students of Imam Malik who founded their own madhab. We just know one, and that is Imam Shafi'i. Okay. Formation of the Zaydi madhab, the role of Ali's opinions in human intellect. Okay, that's again back to the sources of law in their system. Human intellect, how do we compare the human intellect in the Zaydi madhab with the human intellect of the Mu'tazilites? For the Mu'tazilites, human intellect takes precedence over revelation. Whereas for the Zaydi, human intellect doesn't take precedence. It's just human intellect is used as a means of analyzing, etc. It has a place, but it doesn't take precedence over revelation. So really, it is more it becomes their name for qiyas. Three main reasons for the disappearance of the Laythi madhab.
Reason for disappearance, he neither compiled or dictated. He didn't compile or dictate them anything. His instructors were nor did he instruct his followers to record his legal opinions.
Yeah, I mean, the idea here is to draw from our understanding rather than read from the text, right? One of the main reasons, because I may ask you the main reason was that Imam al-Shafi'i settled there. He settled in Egypt, so his madhab dominated. He had absorbed everything al-Layth had and applied it along with what he had gathered from the other sources and dominated. The main two books written by Imam al-Shafi'i, his old book was called, first book was called Al-Hujjah, second book called Al-What was the difference between the two of them? Al-Hujjah combined the fiqh of Hijaz and Iraq. Al combined that with the fiqh of Egypt. Compare the conditions concerning the acceptance of hadith placed by Imam Shafi'i and that of Imam Abu Hanifa. Imam Shafi'i held that as long as the hadith was sahih, that was enough. Imam Abu Hanifa said that hadith being sahih with a narration which is sahih was not enough. He insisted that it had to be mashhur. That's the difference between the two. Two of Imam Ahmed's famous teachers, Imam Ahmed's famous teachers, one is a Shafi'i and who was the other one? Abu Yusuf. And two of his famous students, Bukhari and Muslim. Then question 50 addresses the struggle Imam Ahmed had against the Mu'tazilites. Mentioned two of Imam Ahmed's famous, compare and contrast, where was that? I briefly discussed the ideological struggle which he undertook to protect the correct faith. That was against the Mu'tazilites' belief system, and the main argument or issue was about the creation of the Qur'an. That's question number 50. That's the second part of the question. 51. Compare and contrast Imam Ahmed's position on the use of hadith for Islamic law and that of Imam Shafi'i. Ahmed's position that you could use weak hadith. Ahmed's position that you could use weak hadith. Shafi'i held that the hadith had to be authentic, strong. Identify the factors which saved the Hanbali madhab from extinction. What's the main factor? Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, his movement. because of the fact that he studied in Iraq, and that became his school of law that he studied under, and that's what he taught, and that's what became the official madhab of Saudi Arabia when King Saud took over. He made that the official madhab.
Was that the only thing?
That was the biggest reason. I mean, what else would save it? That's what saved it. Otherwise, it was not the madhab of Arabia. The madhab of Hijaz was basically Hanafi under the Ottomans. Ottomans were Hanafi. They promoted Hanafi thought. So the whole of the eastern side was Hanafi. It became Hanbali was confined at that point to Syria. Few teachers there, etc. It was dying out. It was disappearing. It was Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab who brought it back to Saudi Arabia, and it became the official. His students then promoted it, etc.
It seemed to change. Syria has become Ahnaf and
No. See, it was Syria was a Hanafi location even from then, but you did still have scholars who were Hanbali scholars there. In Egypt, you still had some too, but as I said, it was dying out because unless there was some kind of government support, some kind of movement support, then these madhabs would die out naturally, as the stronger ones would displace the weaker ones. Weaker in terms of followers, not necessarily in terms of reasoning, etc. Why did Imam Ahmed discredit ijma'? And what aspect of it did he accept? He accepted ijma' of the Sahaba. He discredited ijma' in general after the time of the Sahaba because he felt people had spread all over. To establish an ijma' would have been very difficult. From whose circle of learning was Imam Dawood al-Zahiri expelled? And for what reason was he expelled? Circle of learning of Imam Ahmed. Why did Imam Ahmed expel him?
because he raised a question on
Creation of the Qur'an, which implied in his answer that the Qur'an was created. So Imam Ahmed had him removed, expelled him to avoid fitna. So what was the main fiqh issue which led him to differ from the other leading scholars, and how did he resolve it? Why did they call him a Zahiri? He focused only on the literal meanings of the texts. That's why, which is called the Zahir. So that's why he became known as al-Zahiri. Now, what is the main issue which led him to differ? He denied qiyas because he's taking the literal meaning, no need for qiyas. However, he ended up making qiyas using another title. What did he call it? Mafhum. That which is understood or implied. Huh? Yeah.